Welcome back, Crazy Fact Seekers. I'm the Crazy Fact Lady, and I'm here today to give you 10 facts that history doesn't want you to know about George Washington. If you haven't already, please subscribe so you don't miss out on any great content. I post a couple of videos each week featuring 10 crazy, fun, or just plain weird facts about anything that strikes my fancy. People, places, things. You never know what I'll come up with next. But today, it's all about George Washington. Let's get to it. Fact number one: George Washington never went to school past the age of 15. Both of his brothers attended Appleby Grammar School in England, but since they were much older half brothers, and Washington's father had died a few years earlier, there was no money left to send George abroad for additional schooling. This was a time when social status meant everything, and he benefited greatly from his half brother Lawrence's marriage into the wealthy Fairfax family. Since he lived with his older half brother, he spent a lot of time at the Fairfax estate. In fact, it was the Fairfax family that gave him his first job as a surveyor for their family land when he was only 17. This job provided him with enough money to purchase his first plot of land and the advantage of knowing what lands would be more valuable, allowing the start of his massive 70,000 plus acreage estate. Most of the rest of his schooling was simply practicing the rules of civility to improve his social skills. Washington is lauded for being the only slave-owning president who freed all of his slaves. But did he? George Washington inherited his first 10 slaves when he was only 11 years old. It is said that throughout his life he often changed his view on slavery and the appropriateness of owning human beings. There are records of Washington purchasing at least 8 more slaves before he married the wealthy Martha Custis. When he married Martha, he immediately got possession of her 84 slaves. In the following 16 years, he purchased another 40 slaves. It was during the American Revolution that he began to question the correctness of slavery and vowed to never buy another human. But this would not be true. While accounts of his treatment of slaves vary from Richard Parkinson's description of him as treating his slaves with more severity than any other man, to a foreigner's description of him as treating his slaves far more humanely than his fellow citizens of Virginia. It was clear that his slaves wanted freedom, and George Washington didn't want to give it to them. Laws in Pennsylvania made it so that if a slave resided there for more than 6 months, they could establish their freedom. While living in Pennsylvania, the Washingtons went to great trouble to ensure that their slaves were transported between states on a regular interval, so none of them could gain their freedom. Washington also tracked down his slaves that escaped and traveled to the free states in the North. One house servant made a new life for herself in New Hampshire, but George paid Joseph Whipple to track her down so she could be returned to him. Another slave, a chef named Hercules, who was bought from Washington's neighbor for unpaid bills, escaped to New York. Since Washington could not locate her and force her back, he broke his promise not to buy another slave and purchased a new chef from Virginia. At the time of his death, he owned 123 slaves, and only one was freed. The remainder were set to be freed upon the death of his wife, even though she had nearly 200 slaves of her own that she would later will to her grandchildren. Martha eventually freed the remainder of George's slaves before her death, but only out of fear that they were trying to kill her. Another common myth about George Washington is that his dentures were wooden. He actually had several different sets of dentures, as dentists were still experimenting with different methods to make them more effective. Many of Washington's dentures contained cow teeth, ivory, and even human teeth. Dentists would run ads in the local papers seeking to buy teeth to use in dentures. Only the poor and very desperate would sign up to have their teeth pulled without anesthesia and sold to wealthy people for their dentures. The wealthy people receiving the dentures never knew who sold the dentist's teeth, but you can guarantee they were very poor, slaves, or already deceased. In fact, Washington once sold several teeth from his slaves to Jean-Pierre Lemure. On the bright side, it appears as though he allowed his slaves to keep the money he received for their teeth. George Washington's ambition is considered to be what started the French and Indian War, also known as the 7-Year War. A 21-year-old George Washington, who had absolutely no military experience, was awarded the military adjutant position simply because his older brother was a military adjutant before he had died, so Washington claimed his role as his heir. It was here that his ambition took over. The French and British were bickering over who got to claim what territory in the United States. This upset a very wealthy Virginian, Robert Dinwiddie, because it threatened his investments. Dinwiddie was denied by the governing bodies of America to raise a militia and fight the French. But like most kids who don't get the answer they like from mom, he went to dad. King George II gave him permission to fight the French because it benefited Britain. Upon hearing this, Washington, who still had absolutely no military experience, rushed to Virginia and volunteered to lead the mission. Dinwiddie instructed Washington to take a letter to the French and only to observe and report back on their forts, weapons, and people. Washington did as instructed, but decided that he was sure the French wanted to attack and reported this to Dinwiddie. Again, the ruling House of America, the House of Burgesses, denied an attack, but the Governor's Council waited until the House of Burgesses was not in session and approved the money to raise a militia. Washington, of course, volunteered to lead this and began his way back to the French forts. While on his way, he received word that there was a French group close. He took 40 men and found the French sleeping in a gully. As the French began to wake up and saw the British surrounding them, the fight began. No one is sure if the French fired up at the British surrounding them, or if Washington's men fired down at the French before they could wake up and assemble, but needless to say, Washington's men had a distinct advantage. When the battle was over, 14 of the French convoy were dead, including a notable leader. As it turns out, the French were on an ambassador mission when they were surrounded and shot at, and provided papers to Washington after their slaughter to prove it. But he dismissed this claim and insisted he was right. This, compounded with the death of their notable leader, sparked even more anger between the French and British, causing the 7 Years' War. It is widely accepted that this war is a primary driver for the start of the Revolutionary War. When the Continental Army was raised for the Revolutionary War, Washington was appointed as commander, even though he had never led a unit with more than 2,000 men. He was now in charge of more than 200,000 men. This appointment came after the British refused to appoint him to the Royal Army, even though Washington requested it. The British refused him because he was a colonial. Ironically, part of his being appointed to the Continental Army was because he had never served in the British Army, even though he would have if they would have accepted him. One of the main acts Washington did as commander of the Continental Army was to build a spy ring. To protect himself, he did not run this ring himself, nor talk to the people risking their lives to gain America's freedom. Instead, he tasked a lower-ranking official, Major Benjamin Talmadge, to lead this ring. Talmadge's friends and acquaintances would go on to risk their lives for over 5 years in what became known as the Culper spy ring. While the spies would remain anonymous, Washington would gain accolades for his uncanny ability to predict the British's plots. Side note, there is a very good series called Turn, Washington Spies that is based on Talmadge's spy ring. I would suggest watching it if you'd like to learn more. Before Washington became famous in the American Revolution, he ran for a seat in the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses was a ruling body with 2 representatives from each colony that made laws and evaluated petitions. When Washington ran for a seat in 1755, he received only 40 of the 580 votes. 2 years later, he ran again. This time he threw an elaborate party for the members who cast the votes. This party included 46 gallons of beer, 40 gallons of rum punch, 35 gallons of wine, 2 gallons of cider, and a gallon of brandy. The cost of this party was about 40 pounds then, or the equivalent of nearly $14,000 today. After throwing this party, he received 300 of the 750 votes and won a seat in the House. While Washington struggled to win an election into the House of Burgesses before the American Revolution, he had no troubles winning the presidency after. He was unanimously elected as the first president in 1789. What history leaves out is that a large part of his appeal to the colonists was the fact that he had no biological children. Martha had 2 young children from her previous marriage when she married George, and despite raising and loving these children as his own, he and Martha did not have any children together. The colonists saw this as a huge advantage, since it ruled out the possibility of following the British government and building a monarchy. Since Washington had no children of his own, there would be no one for him to pass his position onto when he died. At the time, there were no term limits for presidents, and it was assumed that Washington could remain president for the rest of his life if he chose. Washington was again elected unanimously a second time in 1792. This time, his inaugural speech would only be a total of 134 words and would go down in history as the shortest speech still to this day. What did he have to say after gaining the prestigious honor of unanimously being reelected as president? Fellow citizens, I am again called upon by the voice of my country to execute the function of its chief magistrate. When the occasion proper for it shall arrive, I shall endeavor to express the high sense I entertain of this distinguished honor, and of the confidence which has been reposed in me by the people of United America. Previous to the execution of any official act of the President, the Constitution requires an oath of office. This oath I am now about to take, and in your presence, that if I shall be found during my administration of the government I have in any instance violated willingly or knowingly the injunctions thereof, I may be subject to the upbraidings of all who are now witnesses of this solemn ceremony. Despite being known as one of the greatest generals of all time and having an intricate spy ring feeding him with constant information, Washington only won 6 of the 17 battles that he commanded in the Revolutionary War. He lost 7 of them, and 4 ended up in a draw. And there you have it. That's 10 things history doesn't want you to know about George Washington. I hope you learned something new. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, share, anything to spread knowledge to your friends. After all, you never know when you might need this useless information.